Dread. Dread is the centerpiece of Lovecraftian horror. Inconceivable gods worshipped by lost cults and religions, forbidden knowledge and insights about the foundation of our reality that was never meant to be understood by human minds, twisting and distorting them into madness at the existential horror of the truth at the bedrock of our existence. It is this feeling that was never meant to work in a game driven by overt violence and characterized by its in-your-face take on themes of the divine. But Doom the Dark Ages made it work. On the 26th of April, fans of the Doom franchise were shocked by the unexpected reveal of Cthulhu, the Lovecraftian god, high priest of the Great Old Ones and part-time Rule 34 model, featuring in the forthcoming Doom the Dark Ages, or at least something resembling Cthulhu. The reveal was delivered through the lens of the new Cosmic Realm location, a dark cyclopean landscape that embodies the unknowable horror of Lovecraftian dread. New hellish creatures and demons from the vast expanses of a realm of boundless fear, joining the cast of familiar mainstays that call the wastelands of hell their home. Some of these twisted Lovecraftian reflections of their namesakes, such as the Cosmic Baron and the new variation of the Keiko demon. Their designs are a tortured marriage of stretched flesh, exposed bone, brain matter, and rows of jagged teeth. But these creatures were just a small part of why the new Lovecraftian setting was so effective. id Software, the developers of Doom the Dark Ages, understood that Lovecraftian horror is conveyed through an atmosphere of helplessness, dread, and despair. The challenge of embedding a subtle form of horror through the eyes of the Doomslayer, an unstoppable force with no contrary immovable object, was anything but easy. However, in the latter stages of the game, the cosmic dread and feeling of helplessness that comes from being in a foreign dimension that is governed by unknowable gods, toying with this apex predator, just worked so incredibly well. In theory, Lovecraft and Doom just shouldn't work. Subtlety versus conspicuousness, but it does. And fans agreed. It's not just a game, it's a pilgrimage, a brutal, blood-soaked 120 FPS pilgrimage where your only god is a spiked flail that turns skulls into prayer beads. You can chop both demons' arms and they will stare at you until death. 10 out of 10 game. Captain Doomerica Pacific Rim Pissed Off Laser Dragon. That's all you need to know. Shut up and buy it. Just beat it yesterday, and I would have got the Platinum Trophy too if it wasn't for those meddling demons corrupting the last trophy to be unachievable. A coming-of-age story about a British boy being sent on errands by his abusive parents. This game rip and tore my wallet apart. Product received for free. Gamers were impressed by the continuation of the franchise's patented ability to iterate its gameplay with each new entry, and id Software's creative caliber to marry these contrarian worlds, Lovecraftian horror and the adrenaline-fueled battlefields of Doom. To pull this off takes some great creative ingenuity, as there are many examples of Lovecraftian worlds in the pantheon of gaming. There's a simple reason for why Lovecraftian horror is so pervasive in video games. The immersiveness of interacting with a world and having agency to make decisions and experience it can create an all-encompassing feeling of suffocating dread, as real as the feeling that H.P. Lovecraft created through his words on the written page. There have been many attempts at adapting Lovecraft's work into video games, much of these relegated to the horror genre. Bloodborne, Call of Cthulhu, Darkest Dungeon all have disparate experiences capturing a very similar essence, the destabilizing experience of understanding or observing forbidden knowledge of the unknown. During the early 2000s, a string of games were released to high praise that explored the concept of sanity being codified as a Lovecraftian-inspired game mechanic. The notion was that to enhance the feeling of anxiety, pressure, and dread, players would be punished for acts that would drive one closer to insanity. These punishments would accumulate and manifest as a variety of impediments to the player's experience. This was arguably first introduced, and to some fans, perfected, by a GameCube exclusive title called Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Released in mid-2000s, 2002 and developed by the now defunct studio Silicon Knights, Eternal Darkness was a critical success upon its release and received a large number of awards owing to its story and uniqueness of gameplay. In particular, the sanity mechanic, which at the time was highly innovative, would decrease gradually as players were detected by enemies. If the meter decreased enough, players would experience a range of possible outcomes, from smaller obscurities like unsettling audio cues or rotated camera angles, to less subtle and more intrusive outcomes like blood dripping from the walls. However, However, the most famous occurrence was the possibility of fourth wall breaking anomalies, including a fake blue screen of death, that would attempt to convince the player that their GameCube had errored out before they could save their progress. It would only be a few years later, in October of 2004, that another game would adapt this same mechanic to a more direct Lovecraftian title, namely Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. A first-person survival horror game, Call of Cthulhu similarly adopted a sanity mechanic that would weaken as players interacted with unsettling characteristics of the game world. However, it could be remedied by defeating enemies or seeking refuge in pre-designated areas of safety. The FPS elements of the game hindered some of the more intense experiences of helplessness, enabling the player to maintain a semblance of safety and control through self-defense. However, its ability to instill fear through a suffocating atmosphere was enough to bring some praise to the game despite its many technical shortcomings. The sanity mechanic would be adapted and readapted time and time again, arguably popularized by the 2010 commercial hit Amnesia: The Dark Descent and a small, well-known, excitable Swedish man.
Let's move this fucking car. There we go. I found it.
At its core, the sanity mechanic was meant to elicit a lack of control, a lack of certainty, and force the player to feel a claustrophobic sense of helplessness. Layered with horrors unknown, the Lovecraftian elements were at the foundation. Whether the core focus of the game or a borrowed concept from Lovecraft's themes, sanity was used as a proxy for making the player feel more disorientated and powerless, thereby enhancing that looming feeling of dread that comes from crossing the dark threshold of a door where something terrifying is just out of reach. As time went on, these survival horror elements were translated into more action-oriented games. The challenge to convey existential dread in an environment where combat takes focus was different than that of survival horror. Not necessarily more challenging, but definitely different. Games like Darkest Dungeon that took a more literal approach to mental health impacting the player experience, or Forgive Me Father that focused more on overall atmosphere than a direct game mechanic. There is no better example of action-centric Lovecraftian horror being delivered to perfection than From Software's gothic masterpiece, Bloodborne. Bloodborne, an action horror RPG released in March of 2015, is one of the most celebrated video games of all time, not only because of its incredible setting, combat, aesthetic, narrative, the list goes on. At its heart, Bloodborne is a Lovecraftian horror that is more starkly apparent as players progress within the game. However, Bloodborne didn't entirely focus on the concept of sanity. It certainly explored it to a very great extent, but would instead elevate the core concept of insight. The genius of Hidetaka Miyazaki's narrative focus on the concept of insight was the underlying perceptiveness that he had about the human condition. Insight is gained through acts within the game that reveal knowledge about the true nature of the game's universe, sitting just out of sight of human capabilities to comprehend. Observing bosses for the first time and defeating them, as an example, grants insight to the player. With enough insight, the player will begin to experience events that were previously unobservable. For example, the amygdalas that appear around the cathedral wards silently observing the player. These revelations aren't simply new knowledge of the unknown. To describe it that way is a little bit reductive. If anything, Miyazaki was intending to liken the expansion of one's knowledge of the universe to something more intimately human, like coming to grips with our own mortality, for example, or even the ever-present threat of cosmic annihilation. These horrifying revelations that destabilize our perception of our own reality and provide us with a sobering experience of our own existence, an inescapable lack of control over our own reality, and the dread that accompanies it. This is the Lovecraftian experience, and Miyazaki's magnum opus captured it effortlessly. Since Bloodborne's release, there have been many other incredible games exploring Lovecraftian horror and the Cthulhu mythos through an action-focused framework, but it would be remiss of me not to mention the first game that kind of started it all, that brings us squarely back to where this video began, the origins of Doom: The Dark Ages and its Lovecraftian world. id Software is the company that published the original Doom on the 10th of December 1993. The commercial and critical success of the game and its predecessor, Wolfenstein, enabled id Software to focus on new creative projects, including the legendary Quake. Quake's launch on the 22nd of June 1996 was an enormous success, a Lovecraftian 3D first-person shooter, the first of its kind in the history of gaming. Quake's legacy as one of the most influential and beloved games in the history of the games industry is credited to its ambition. Quake is set in a war-torn future where teleportation technology called slipgates led to the invasion of the human realm by an extra-dimensional race of beings led by evil Lovecraftian cosmic deities. The unnamed protagonist's goal was to defeat the entity leading the invasion of humanity, codenamed Quake. This entity synthesized its own teleportation systems with the slipgates created by humanity, enabling a full-scale invasion of the human race. Look, spoilers ahead, but this game has been out for nearly 30 years at this point, so I think that's probably long enough. Quake, the final boss of the game, is revealed to be Shub Niggurath, a named Old One in H.P. Lovecraft's published work, The Last Test. In the universe of Quake, Shub Niggurath was the Hellmother that held dominion over the monsters that occupied the hellish dimension of the game's universe. The creature features no discernible anthropomorphic features, a union of flesh and tentacles housed in an arena of molten lava. Its form is so alien that it conveys the classical Lovecraftian theme of unknowable terror. Its physical characteristics are so inherently different to ours that its very existence is unsettling, let alone its genocidal ambition against the human race. Amongst a large collection of twisted creatures under Shub Niggurath's control was the game's first boss, Chthon, its large size enhanced by a vertical mouth covered in razor-sharp teeth. So you see, Quake wasn't just inspired by the Cthulhu mythos, it was directly linked to it in an incredibly tangible way. The influence of H.P. Lovecraft on id Software's storytelling has been directly influenced by cosmic horror from the very beginning, over 30 years ago. Although it was 3 decades ago, Quake is definitely not forgotten by id Software, a remaster released only 4 years ago on August 9th of 2021. The genesis of these bizarre creatures were heavily influenced by the great mind of Stanley Peterson, who supported level and scenario design during Quake's development. Peterson is well known for his creation of the tabletop RPG Call of Cthulhu, released in 1981, and it was thanks to his knowledge and obsession with the Cthulhu mythos that Quake was brought into this world. Externally, we know this to be true, as his departure from Quake's release brought a new direction for the Quake franchise's overarching narrative. By modern standards, Quake was a fairly superficial representation of action-focused Lovecraftian horror. Gaming was still in its infancy at the time, and with over 30 years of iteration, id Software were able to observe a swath of new ideas of integrating Lovecraft's mythos into video games. So that leads us to May 15th, 2025, the release of Doom the Dark Ages and the studio's refreshed ideas of Lovecraftian horror. Conveying psychological stress and manipulation through the visor of the Doomslayer is no easy feat. Through the evolution of Lovecraftian themes and mechanics in video games, id Software had a challenge. How do you test the resolve of the most dominant life form in the universe, a being of such power that even the legions of hell fear him? You could try to apply similar mechanics like a sanity meter, but it would conflict with the indomitable spirit of the Doomslayer's character and his eons of experience facing the hordes of hell. So how do you create an environment where the Slayer is subject to dread? It's actually quite simple. You take away his sense of control. Spoilers ahead, I'll be talking about the late game of Doom the Dark Ages content, so skip to this timestamp to avoid this part of the discussion if you haven't yet played the game. In the late game of Doom the Dark Ages, the player enters the cosmic realm and is immediately given that unsettling feeling of not being in Kansas anymore. Incomprehensible creatures roaming the skies, masses of enormous tentacles swaying in the expanses of a hostile realm, unnerving doors to new planes of existence, and a pitch-black ocean concealing horrors unimaginable that you are forced to traverse without your steel-barreled sword in hand. The cosmic realm is intentionally disparate from the domains of hell and earth that we're used to walking in the shoes of the Doomslayer. Outside of the standard hostility and aggression that is synonymous with the franchise, the moments of destabilization are found in the quieter times, seeking collectibles and secrets from around the levels of the cosmic realm. In the pursuit of these trinkets, you're left more than once with a moment of confusion. A door that was once present is now no longer, a hallway that simply never ends, floor that mysteriously collapses beneath you without any tangible mechanism for it. You're at the mercy of forces beyond your comprehension, and without the ability to shoot your way through to a conclusion, you're forced to play whatever game these entities have laid out for you. Vulnerability is the feeling that the player experiences in these quiet moments, and this anxiety is even more greatly conveyed in the underwater segments. You, as the Slayer, are forced to swim through an open ocean, which more accurately might be described as an abyss, darkness swallowing any sense of orientation that the player might glean. The intrusive thoughts of some enormous creature that call this ocean home swallowing you whole are almost unavoidable, even in the visor of the Doomslayer, knowing that ancient evil is watching just beyond a thin veil, unshackled by your own actions, creates an environment where the Doomslayer in all his indomitable strength and power feels exposed. The accompanying sense of dread in these moments is nothing if not palpable. Couple these experiences with the enormity of the architecture of the cosmic realm, there's a constant sense that the scale of the beings in this place are far beyond anything we've experienced, an eternal horizon hiding these cosmic entities just out of sight. We're in an alien world, but not alien in the sense that we've seen before, creatures from some different planet, alien as in foreign, a reality we have no comprehension of, putting us again at a complete disadvantage. id Software's genius was in realizing that to inject Lovecraftian horror into the world of Doom, they only needed to make the Doomslayer feel dread. Despite some of the more brash uses of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos towards the very end of the game, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about.
Let them fight.
id Software triumphed in overcoming an extraordinary challenge of bringing Lovecraft into the world of Doom. However, it is somewhat unsurprising as Lovecraftian horror is in the studio's DNA, and biding their time over 3 decades gave them time to mature and perfect their understanding of the source material, creating a truly unique and unforgettable adaptation of Lovecraft's awe-inspiring take on horror. Lovecraftian horror is a subtle exploration of the vulnerability that we feel at horrifying existential revelations, the lack of control and smallness we feel in an unfeeling universe that governs our actions beyond our will, an ever-looming threat that creeps ever closer, like the sentence of our own mortality, dread. Dread is the centerpiece of Lovecraftian horror, an experience that through time has been adapted and analyzed through the lens of various gaming environments, a timeline of creative projects that id Software silently observed and decided to interpret in their very own way, understanding that while the only thing that the Horde fears is the Doomslayer, the only fear we've felt since walking his path ourselves is the unknown.